if you think about the cultural and social dynamics in a lot of the traditional education system, a lot of it can be explained by seeking status, both from students and by teachers and educators. We try to think a lot about both from a product perspective in terms of the software that we build, but also from the day-to-day experience of the students. How do you make those things high status? Because every kid and every human is going to seek status. And I don't think that's a bad thing. And so I think there's a lot of like very subtle ways that you do this. But once you create that culture, it becomes really powerful because you end up in a situation where there's a lot of inertia towards the status framework that people operate within. And then all of a sudden you're working really hard and want to work on ambitious projects and maybe fail on some really cool things that you want to work on because that's what everyone else thinks is cool at Primer.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Ryan Delk. Ryan is the founder and CEO of Primer, a network of microschools currently based in Florida and Arizona, but in the process of expanding to more states and eventually across the country. In today's episode, Ryan and I talk about the systems that Primer has built across their network, the regulatory engine, the operational playbooks, the curriculum, the software tools to help make it as easy as possible for teachers to do the things they love most, like recruiting students and running their school, and to help them avoid a lot of the landmines and problems that people run into when they're starting a school, things like finding a location and working through all of the regulatory necessities to get a school off the ground. We talk about the work that Ryan has done in terms of handling regulations and making it as easy as possible for school leaders to launch schools. And we talk about how in some cases, he's even worked to change state law to make it easier for people to launch private schools. We talk about the educational philosophy that underpins the resources that Primer is building. And we talk about the new Primer leader cohort that Primer is launching to help educators go through the process of launching their own microschool. I had Ryan on the show about a year ago to talk about the story of starting Primer, his own education, what led him to believe that building a network of microschools was the most impactful thing he could do in education. And today's conversation was a really fun follow-up to hear all the updates of what Primer's been up to and to go deep in the weeds on this new Primer leader cohort that they're building. Today's conversation was super fun, and I hope you enjoy listening. Ryan Delk, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I don't often get to say welcome back. I'm usually busy talking to new people, but it's always such a pleasure to have a repeat guest, and I'm so stoked to have you back on the show. It feels like we're very due for a conversation because a lot has happened since you came on the podcast last. You're busy building a network of microschools, and things happen very quickly when you're expanding a school network. What's the latest with Primer?
What's the latest with Primer? We have 23 microschools that are live across Florida and Arizona. We are going to be expanding into new states next year, which we can talk about. First day of schools on Monday for all the schools in Florida. So the team is busy getting ramped up for that. But yeah, things are good.
Can you pull back the curtain? What happens in the week before the first day of school when you're running a whole microschool network? What are you guys doing now to make sure everything's prepped for next week? Like, do most things happen prior to the week before and you guys are mostly ready to go? Or are there lots of last minute things that have to happen to get everything ready?
Luckily we're mostly in the business of empowering the great microschool leaders that we have to go run their schools. And so, I think for the first year, it was a lot more of us, kind of feeling like we were doing everything to learn the ropes and figure out how to get things off the ground. But now we spend a lot more energy just empowering the MLs and the microschool leaders, and they're incredible. They're like my heroes. And so for the most part, they have their game plans and they're off to the races and they're meeting families and kids are, getting ready. And we spend most of our time thinking about what are the leverage points that we can build from product to process and game plans and playbooks and all that to help them be successful. And then all the regulatory work that's required to get the schools ready for the first day and get them approved with the Department of Education and all those pieces. So we spend most of our time on that, and then try to defer to the great micro school leaders for how they want to kick off the year.
How many of these 23 locations are new this year?
We have, we grew about 3x ish year over year. So we've had some that switched locations and then some that we consolidated because they were growing faster.
One of the reasons I was super stoked to have you back on the show is because you're launching a new program, your primer leadership cohort. Can we talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. I think this is the first time we talked about it publicly. So we'll announce this probably at the same time this episode comes out. Our vision for Primer has always been to get to the point where you can take the Primer software stack, the regulatory engine that we've built, the operations engine that we built, and you can, if you're a motivated educator who wants to launch a micro school in your community, you can use the Primer engine to go do that. And that's obviously very hard. Launching a new school requires students, locations, a great teacher, all the academic, the full academic program, everything that Primer OS, the software we built, does. And so we are finally at the point where we're ready to do that. And so we're opening up the Primer leader cohort for applications. If you're a educator in Florida, Alabama, Arizona, Texas, or other states, but those are the four that we're focused on, we would love for you to apply. It's a 9-month program. You can do it in parallel with your current role as an educator. So it's a nights and weekends type thing. And we will help you use the Primer engine to launch a primer in your community. And so over the last 3 years, we've had hundreds, maybe thousands of educators from across the country reach out in places that we're not located, saying, hey, I really want to launch a primer in Austin or Birmingham or Atlanta or Phoenix or wherever. And we've always told them, hey, eventually we're going to get there. We're going to get to the point where we're ready for that. And it's pretty exciting that I feel like we finally are ready. The team has done an incredible amount of work over the last year, specifically on Primer OS, which is the software that we've built, to get to the point where a really motivated teacher could take that and be able to go launch a primer. And so we're going to select a number of finalists over the next couple of weeks. We've already had some incredible applicants apply, and then we'll kick off the first cohort in September. And then they will work towards launching their own primer in August of 2025.
That's so exciting. I'm so excited that you guys are at a point where you're ready to do this, because that speaks volumes about the level of work that you've put into all of the infrastructure that makes it ready to hand off. And I'm really excited to see this expand. How many participants do you intend to have in the first cohort? Do you have a cap, or is it a matter of how many applicants you get and the number will vary? What are you guys aiming for?
We don't have a hard cap. We do have a very high bar for who we will accept, especially in the first cohort. So I suspect we will end up with high hundreds or low thousands applications, and then we'll end up selecting somewhere between 3 and 8%, would be my guess, to be finalists and join the cohort. But it's really, there's no hard cap. It's more of people that we feel like really could be a great fit at launching a primer.
What are you looking for in those applicants? What signals to you that somebody is a good fit?
So there's 3 things that I do the final interview with every primer leader, and I hope to do that for a very long time. There's 3 things that we look for. The first is someone who's a strong educator. That's sort of like the table stakes. And so we look for someone who, talk to their parents. We want them to say, every student has someone they would say like, oh, that teacher changed my life. We want the educators that are launching primers to be that person to ideally a lot of kids. The second is we're looking for someone who is very strong operationally. So running, one of the theses that we have is that really great teachers and educators are actually, they're kind of almost like small business owners or entrepreneurs in the way they have to approach even teaching in the traditional system. And so they actually that skill set translates really well into running a micro school. And so we're looking for someone who's good at operations, can run the school really, really well. And so that's all the intangibles of making sure the space is really crisp, making sure they can execute on our playbooks for what the sort of physical experience needs to be like. So that's number two. And then number three, and those two are actually fairly easy. The third one is much harder, which is finding someone who can think outside of the constraints that are placed on them by the traditional education system. And so I always give, in my final interview, maybe I'll have to change it now if I talk about it now, but one of the questions I ask is I say, let's take a student. So let's pretend you have, and I just make up an example. Let's pretend you have a sixth grade girl in your micro school, and she wants to be an NFL statistician. She loves the NFL, and she wants to work at on an NFL team and be the person that's in charge of running models and figuring out who they should draft and who the best value picks are left and how they should think about trades and all that. If you had this person and they had 2 hours a day on Primer Pursuits, which is our afternoon time where kids can go deep on things they're excited about. Let's say they had 2 hours a day for 6 months to work on a project related to this. How would you structure that project? And 95% of people that apply say some version of, I would get a, trifold board. I would have them do a bunch of research. I would have them print out some, graphs. I would have them present to the class at like a science fair or something. And the 5% of them say some version of, I would email the closest NFL team, and I would explain to them that I have this incredible sixth grade girl who wants to be an NFL statistician. She's been working for 6 months on a presentation on what the Miami Dolphins should do with their draft picks this year. She's built a model. She's written a paper on why she thinks this is the correct strategy based on the current roster and who's available in the draft and the value. And she would love to come in and present it to you all and get real feedback from the team. It shouldn't take more than 30 minutes of your time. We can come by anytime. And let us know if that'll work. And we're looking for people who think like that, even if they can't actually make that happen. We want someone who thinks like that, who is capable of delivering those kind of experiences for students. Obviously, you can't do that every time, but we find that like we operate outside of the confines of the traditional system, and it's often very hard for people to rewire their brains into what's possible in an education environment where you don't have those same constraints. And so that third piece is actually the hardest thing to find, and that's what we end up rejecting the most candidates for, is not hitting that bar.
This is a tangential story, but when I worked at Praxis, the startup apprenticeship program, we had a participant who he worked in data science, and he'd gotten a job with a startup he went to Carnegie Mellon University, dropped out, got a job at a data science company instead. We supported him in doing that. But really what he wanted to do was work in baseball. He wanted to work on the data team and an MLB team.
Yeah.
And so he was always he just couldn't help himself. He was always working on projects just on his own that were related to baseball stats. And the team he really wanted to work for was the Tampa Bay Rays because they were the most innovative in their statistical work because they had the lowest budget. So they had to be super creative about very, very Moneyball. And so they had a job posting that was for his dream job. And so he put together a whole project and applied, and he ended up getting it. And he was, I think, the only person in his whole office that didn't have a college degree, but they loved the fact that he was always working on projects, and he had, because he was always working in it, he had really interesting insights and really interesting things to bring to the table. He ended up being the head of their pitching statistics team, which was super awesome. That was after a few years of working in their office and working his way up inside of the stats team. But he was able to get that job because he wasn't doing the normal things. Yeah. He was actually doing hands-on projects and being unafraid of putting himself out there to show the world that that's what he was working on, which is a very natural continuation from the example that you're giving. If you have a sixth grader who is putting together a project and actually doing the work, like actually building meaningful skills, not just presenting on what somebody else is doing, and then they have the chance to go talk to somebody on the team that they would want to work with someday, and they realize that there's not this invisible magical barrier of entry to start having conversations with people. They realize that that's accessible. that puts you on the trajectory to eventually be the person who's able to get the job doing those sorts of things. And I think that philosophy, it applies at every stage of the educational cycle, but it's so hard to it's so counter to the schooled mindset that we talk about all the time that it's very hard to find people who think that way. But it's such a superpower when you do. So I love that that's something that you screen for, because I've seen it happen in real life and it works, and it's really cool when it does.
Yeah, it's just an incentives problem. Like the traditional system, every human is going to optimize for the incentive structure they operate within. And so the traditional system doesn't incentivize educators to engage in those kind of projects or structures for kids. And I actually think most educators would love to do that. And they actually are very altruistically motivated and would be excited by it. But they operate within an incentive structure that doesn't allow them to, or certainly doesn't encourage those kind of projects. And so that's where you get the experience that most kids have in the traditional system.
How do you build an environment that does incentivize that sort of thinking and those sorts of actions? What are you guys doing besides explicitly hiring for it? How are you building a structure that does incentivize that sort of thing?
There's a great line in an essay by actually a primary investor who he says humans are status-seeking monkeys, I think is the way that he frames it. And it's actually about something totally unrelated, but that line is something we talk about internally a lot. And if you think about the cultural and social dynamics in a lot of the traditional education system, a lot of it can be explained by seeking status, both from students and by teachers and educators. And so we think about this both from a student lens as well as an educator lens. From a student lens, you want to make the high status things within the culture of the school, within the culture of the primer. You want them to be the things that are accretive to their development as a human, to human flourishing. So you want them to, you want working really hard to be a high status thing. You want making academic progress to be a high status thing. You want working on really ambitious projects that might fail but are exciting to be a high status thing. And so we try to think a lot about, both from a product perspective in terms of the software that we build, but also from the day-to-day experience of the students. How do you make those things high status? Because every kid and every human is going to seek status, and I don't think that's a bad thing. The bad thing where it gets toxic is when the things that become legible for the status games are actually toxic and have negative effects on you as a human. And then from the micro school leader side, from the primer leaders, we try to do the same thing, where the high status thing is coming up with really cool projects for your students. And when a student's really interested in a given topic and you go above and beyond to deliver some incredible pursuit for them to work on, you're going to get a phone call or text from me saying, hey, this is amazing. Like, this is incredible. Like, tell me more about this. We're going to promote it on social media. We'll do videos about it. And so I think there's a lot of like very subtle ways that you do this, but once you create that culture, it becomes really powerful, because you end up in a situation where there's a lot of inertia towards those towards the status framework that people operate within. And then when new people are added in, whether they're educators or students, the status, the way that the people think about status and being cool within an organization or a culture is sort of set. And then all of a sudden you're working really hard and want to work on ambitious projects and maybe fail on some really cool things that you want to work on, because that's what everyone else thinks is cool at Primer. So that's mostly how we attack it.
How does the network of schools work for the individual who is running a specific Primer location? You've talked a lot about the engine of Primer, and I want to go in and break down the engine and talk about all the mechanics of it. What are the pieces that are network wide? What are the support structures that people have to lean on? And how does the infrastructure actually work?
Yeah, good question. So we have this software that we built called Primer OS, which is the overarching engine for the teacher experience, the parent experience, and the student experience at Primer. It also handles a lot of the regulatory pieces that are required for both like state and local filings and things like that. We think about the teacher experience. We think about what are the framework that we use for the teacher experience is what are the things that a 99th percentile teacher would intuitively know how to do? And how do we productize that, or maybe intuitively know how to do on their best days when they're most engaged and most with it? And how do we productize that such that a 75th percentile teacher or even a 99th percentile teacher could do that every single day? And so, as an example, a really, really great teacher in a classroom is going to know roughly where everyone is academically at all times. They will know when kids are struggling with the same concepts, and they might break them up into small groups to work on those concepts together. They might even put someone who is a little bit more advanced in that subject or that concept to actually like kind of mentor them and help them walk through it. They would know really quickly when someone's falling behind. It wouldn't take them weeks or months to discover that a student's falling behind. And these are all things that great teachers do organically. But it requires a bunch of context. It requires real-time data, which teachers are getting through a bunch of different sources, including just, interactions with a student they're, interpreting in certain ways. And so what we try to do with Primer OS, just using those examples, is make that almost effortless for a teacher. And so when a student is, when they need to do breakout groups for students, they can hit one button in the OS and it will automatically break out students with exactly where they are on a given subject academically. So students that have mastered or haven't mastered certain concepts are grouped into small groups of 2 or 3 students to work together on projects, and they don't have to think about that at all. And all that data it's actually far better data than they could ever have from them just intuitively picking it up in the classroom, because we're looking at all their tests and assessments. We're looking at their progress in different learning apps. We're looking at the courses that they're taking. And it's like down to the day in terms of how updated it is. And so that's on the teacher side. That's really what we focus on, is how do we help teachers deliver an exceptional experience for students without having to be like this, world-class, one of the best teachers in the world. On the student side, we want students to have total transparency into how they're doing academically. They set goals, and every 5 weeks they revisit those. They set those goals and revisit those goals every 5 weeks, and they're accountable to those goals, not really to their teacher and their parents, but actually to their classmates. And so it's much more about peer accountability. So if you walk into a primer, even when kids are like playing outside, you could ask them how they're doing on their goals, and every single one of them could tell you exactly how they're tracking down to the number against their goals, because they've totally internalized this idea, and they're like bragging with each other about who's farther along and how they're catching up. And it's not about impressing their teacher. There's a lateral sense of accountability within the culture. And then for the parents, we believe that parents deserve total transparency into what their kids are reading, learning, what they're struggling with, what they're mastering. And so at Primer, as a parent, the second your child masters 3 digits of subtraction, that day. Or if they haven't mastered it, you also know that. And so you have a real-time dashboard where you can look into exactly how the students are operating. And so one of the things that surprised me has been one of our investors, Keith Raboy, when we were first talking about Primer and Microschools, he immediately latched onto this idea of this accumulating advantage that we would have, because we are able to build software and operations playbooks and the regulatory engine across this network of schools. And all the learnings we can then immediately deploy in a way that benefit all the other schools. And so every time we get a piece of feedback from a family or a microschool leader or a student, or every time we see something that's working really well, it's actually quite easy for us to double, triple down on that and then deploy it across all the schools. And then all the students get that benefit. And so I've been surprised at how quickly we've been able to see those dynamics start to happen. And then the product team being able to take those learnings and sometimes just very scarce anecdotes and translate those into things that actually directly accelerate academic progress for every student across all of Primer.
What is the structure of the academic resources inside of the software versus the ability to customize for the teacher? Is there a pretty set of resources that the students are working through, and the teacher is then determining how they want to structure their days and how they want to, like in what order they want students to do things and what they want to intersperse it with? Or is there room for flexibility on the academic side? What is the relationship between the teacher and the software in actually delivering the academic experience inside of the classroom?
Yeah. You can think of it sort of like building blocks. Some of the building blocks are non-negotiable, and others are, negotiable or customizable. So the maximum, the space with maximum customization is the afternoon time. So educators have a lot of primer pursuits can look very different across campus to campus. We have sort of a standardized playbook. We designed a bunch of pursuits that are really great. So if kids are interested in robotics or circuits or art or gardening or microbiology research or whatever, there's pursuits for them to go do that the micro school leader can lead. But they also can take what their kids are interested in and go run with it and do something amazing that we would have never thought of from a centralized team. So that's sort of the point of maximum customization. And then on the core academics, we are very unapologetic about the academic model. We have an incredible academic team that comes from designing curriculum and the academic programs of some of the best schools in the US. And they've developed an academic model that we are very confident in works very well and is always improving. And so we are pretty prescriptive on, especially for math, reading, and writing, how academics at Primer work. And so every student at Primer does 100 minutes of math and 100 minutes of ELA, just reading and writing, every day. And it's totally non-negotiable. And students actually get excited about it because they can set these goals and they can see their progress against those goals. Now that looks differently for every student. So some students might need remedial support. Some students might be in advanced math courses, 2 grades beyond their grade level. But the goal is that every student has an individualized learning path that's designed for them by Primer OS, and they can progress through that through a combination of direct instruction from their Primer leader, through digital learning experiences, through one-on-one or small group tutoring, through advanced courses, whatever they need to accelerate. The system will optimize for that. And then they're going to get an individualized experience. Their parents will have transparency into it, and their micro school leader, it sort of is on autopilot for their micro school leader to be able to deliver.
Is the actual curriculum comparable to the curriculum that a student would move through if they were in a public school going through public school mathematics and public school ELA, minus the level of customization around their... So it sounds like there's a lot of customization around the sort of the level that they're at based on their testing inputs, and then the next lesson that's put in front of them. It sounds like there's a fair amount of tailoring happening inside of the software to the individual student. But beyond that, is a pretty similar curriculum experience, or are there significant differences between the process that students would be moving through inside of public school versus what they're getting inside of your academic software?
The core academics map to state standards in all the states that we operate in. So our schools are approved private schools with the Department of Education in each state. So we adhere to state standards. It's very important to us that if a student, moves to a new state in 8th grade, they can go to high school and they're going to be able to be very successful and at or above grade level for all their core subjects. That said, so it's less about customization of the actual standards themselves and more about customization for the medium with which those are delivered and the pathway that the student progresses. And so we are never going to just drag along a student that's not understanding some core concept and just force them to keep progressing mindlessly and just accelerating their failure. We're going to go back and say, hey, there's these 5 core concepts that you absolutely need to master, even though they're from 2 grades ago. And we're going to go master those, and then we're going to accelerate you back into grade level. And then conversely, for students that are really far ahead, we're not going to make a kid that's at a 5th grade math level sit through a 3rd grade math lessons every single day. And so I would say it's less about customizing the standards and more about the sort of medium and the modality for how we deliver it.
And it's all app-based, right? Like, can you describe, for a parent who hasn't seen an interface like this before, can you describe what the students are actually working inside of on a daily basis? What does it look like?
Yeah. So it's a combination of physical, like in offline experiences in the classroom, direct instruction from the micro school leader, and software-based experiences. And we're very unapologetic about, we believe technology is an incredible tool for student progress, both on core academics and things like the pursuits. Obviously, you don't want students, sort of mindlessly sitting on screens. And I think the screen time can have this sort of bad rap among parents, in some cases, rightfully so. But for us, we believe that in the right doses, in the right structure, with the right accountability, with the right experiences, technology can deliver incredible academic outcomes. And so it depends on the grade level at primer. So K through 2 is much lighter on technology, much heavier emphasis on stations around the classroom, maybe similar to what you'd expect from like a Montessori classroom, lots of physical manipulatives, versus an 8th grader might be spending a lot more time learning to code, working on their computer. And so it depends on the age level. But we do ask most students to spend time every day in some form of learning apps, either that we've designed or that we partner with and integrated into Primer OS, that we know deliver superior academic outcomes. And we think that it's it's the best way for every student to actually have this customized experience. B, the academic outcomes are totally transparent, so the parents can see and the teachers can see how they're progressing. So there's no hiding whether or not it's working or not. And then C, it's what gives us and feeds the data that then allows us to understand exactly where students are and where the gaps are. And so even when there's subjects that might be primarily direct instruction from a teacher in person, there's still going to be a small component of some software to make sure that those concepts are being grasped, that retention is strong, and that students are progressing. And so there's always a layer of software, even in the direct instruction. And that's very, very important to us. And it's not for everybody, but we do think it is very obviously a superior academic model. And the results, I think, speak for themselves.
How do you think about the progression of screen time access as kids get older? Because you mentioned when kids are younger, they're in an environment that's much more like a Montessori classroom. It's very physical, very tangible, not a huge emphasis on screens, although they're using it a little bit. By the time they get older, they might have a very screen heavy academic interface. Is there, like, what's the philosophy that's underpinning how you're thinking through, like, at different age levels, what a student is ready for that's developmentally appropriate for them? Is there some underlying logic that kind of translates to what someone would actually see in the classroom at each grade level?
Yeah. Well, part of it is a lot of kindergartners aren't able to interact with traditional like technology devices because they're not able to read or type, fully for a lot of kindergartners. And so there's like natural limitations on what you can do based on, students' reading and writing abilities. We think about it probably less in terms of, we think about it in terms of probably more about what is the actual optimal experience for the kid. And so when you're in kindergarten, the most important thing we want you to do is we want you to love school. We want you to start understanding the physical world, understanding foundational concepts that are going to help you then learn, reading, writing, math, and start to understand what it's like to work hard on projects that you are really excited about. And so most of those things happen physically for a kindergartner. An 8th grader who's really excited about launching a Shopify store or learning how to code, starting a small business, those things are going to require, in some cases, for them to spend more time on a computer for them to work on these pursuits. And so it's more about the targeting to the individual kid than it is about some hard and fast rule. But in every case, the maximum amount of screen time that kids are spending at primer is about 2 hours a day. So it's not like they're spending all day on screens. But when we have we believe that when that 2 hours is structured really, really well, interspersed throughout the day and the right doses with the right goals for each of those sessions, that can be really powerful and deliver much better academic outcomes than if they were off screens 100% of the day.
I agree completely. My middle and high school education was primarily via screens, and it was amazing. There's all kinds of cool stuff you can do when you leverage the power of technology, especially for older kids.
Yeah.
How does the regulatory side of the engine work? Because you also mentioned that this is a big part of the package that you're providing to your school leaders when somebody comes in and starts a primer. One of the advantages that you have is that you have this built-in regulatory toolkit that they can use to either mitigate or avoid or at least successfully navigate a lot of the hurdles that are such classic cliche things to come up in a conversation when someone's talking about starting a school. The regulatory stuff is always a problem. And I know you guys have done a ton of work on this front, but what does the regulatory side of the engine that you're equipping micro school leaders with look like?
Yeah. So maybe a quick overview for listeners, when you start a school, there are state level requirements that are usually passed via the Department of Education. Sometimes they're legislated directly, but oftentimes they're policies that the Department of Education is setting at the state level. And then those are typically things like attendance policies, state standards for curriculum, vaccination requirements, things like that. And then there's local policies, which are usually focused primarily on fire safety, health safety, and local zoning. So determining in a given building, in a given city, what are the permitted uses of that facility? And if you want to use it in a way that's not a permitted use, how do you go about doing that? What is the process through the bureaucracy of that local county or city to be able to get a certificate of use, certificate of occupancy to use that space for that use? And so if you are an incredible entrepreneurial educator who has dreamed of starting a school, you might already have students ready to go. You might already have, your whole plans ready to go. In almost every case, the hardest part is not the things that you think would be hard, which is recruiting students and having the vision and the willingness to go try to provide a great education for kids in your community. It's actually the regulatory side of it. And so I've talked to at least 50 educators that have come to me outside of primer and just said, hey, I've tried to do this and I got, either I wasted hundreds of thousands of dollars of my life savings trying to get this thing spun up, or it's taken me 2.5 years, or I thought I did everything right and then I got shut down. And there's just story after story. And you can find these, on Twitter and podcasts, and people talk about it often, of these people that have totally altruistic, pure motives to go serve their community and launch a great school and literally just can't do it, either because of time or money or both. And the process is, very opaque, and you got to hire lawyers and lobbyists and all sorts of things. And so one of the primary values that we provide at Primer is you spend exactly 0 minutes of your time and $0 of your money working on any of those problems, because we have chewed a lot of glass over the last 3 years to learn how to do all those things in a bunch of different states, and to do it in a way that's very streamlined and efficient. And so I think the first micro school that we started, I think took us like 18 months or something to get fully approved. And the most recent one, I think we will have done in like 15 weeks or 12 weeks or something like that. And so we are getting really good at understanding how these processes work. How do you front load the process? How you, de-risk a given location before you commit to it. And so when you're launching a school of Primer, we take all that on and you're getting that whole engine behind you. So you don't have to spend any of your energy on it. And you could spend 100% of your time recruiting students that want to join your school, and preparing to deliver a great academic experience for them. And so I think that is probably long-term will be one of the biggest parts of the value that Primer generates for these educators. Because ultimately, really great educators are going to be great at launching schools and recruiting students and delivering a great experience for them. Everything we're building in Primer OS obviously empowers that and I think can accelerate that. But the regulatory part is really the primary friction point right now. And that's the stuff that we actually sort of geek out on and love figuring out how to both understand and then attack. And then we go on the offensive sometimes too. We've changed state law in Florida twice. We got an amendment passed that went into effect a few weeks ago that opens up 50,000 new locations where micro schools can operate by right across the state of Florida. So regardless of what the local zoning was, rather than you having to go through this complicated 12-month process to get the building approved for use as a school, there's 50,000 locations where the local zoning office actually has to give you a certificate of use by right in that building. And so we're happy to go on the offensive and take on those fights. And then hopefully, blaze a trail for thousands of educators to be able to launch these schools they've been dreaming of.
Are these 50,000 locations, what is the common denominator that made them pre-approved?
So we focused on, it's a list of about, I think, 12 different types of locations, but the most common ones are religious facilities like churches, community or churches, synagogues, any type of religious entity that owns a space that's approved for religious gatherings, community centers, libraries, performing arts centers, spaces that typically are going to have underutilized classroom or classroom-like space that's available during the week. And it's actually a huge win for those types of organizations too, because in many cases they need the additional rental income. And so being able to have someone in the space that's a community, positive minded organization, usually aligned with, their goals for their space. If you're a community center, the idea of having 25 kids, from the community coming in every day from 8 to 3 and having families in the space is actually really good for you in achieving your mission and getting rental income from it. And so it's a win-win on both sides. And obviously there was a lot of people that were opposed to it, but from the perspective of parents and educators who want to launch these schools and the organizations themselves, they were all very excited about it.
You said you've changed state law twice. What was the other law that you changed or passed in Florida?
The other one was sort of a more, I would say, sort of a baby version of that one that we passed. So we passed laws in 2 consecutive sessions. The first one was a much more scaled down version of that. And then we came back in the second session with a new piece of legislation that was much more aggressive and went further and specifically codified it for use as private microschools in those spaces in the state law.
How does this process work? How do you actually go about changing the state laws that are holding school founders and micro school leaders back? Because this is a problem all over the country. In every state, so many people have tried to launch schools and either gotten them off the ground and then later had them shut down, or have never been able to get them off the ground in the first place because of the regulations that don't necessarily make sense. They've been on the books for ever. Nobody's terribly incentivized to change them, or maybe incentivized to not change them. There is a lot of work that needs to be done in the vein of what you're talking about. What does this process actually look like? How did you do this?
There's 2 pieces that I think are counterintuitive. So the first is that the people that are writing, even the people that are very deep on the regulation of this stuff, so even the Department of Education directly, and often even in the legislator, when they're the ones, the ones primarily working on the regulation for these types of entities, and this might not be counterintuitive to some people listening, but some people I think it will be, they often don't actually know how a lot of this stuff works. And so when I would sit down with people and I would explain, they would tell me, hey, I don't think this is a problem. Here's my understanding of the situation, or here's what this law says. And then we would say, okay, well, yeah, that's what this law says, but there's this other regulation that you don't know about, or here's how the cities are actually interpreting that law, for example. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding because a lot of people haven't actually gone through the process of launching a school. And so what I would encourage people to do is there's actually an opportunity for education where you can come in and say, hey, I've actually done this. I've done it multiple times. I actually know the ins and outs of this directly. Here's a 1-pager on how this works in this state or city or county or whatever. And here's the things that we could do to streamline this. Now, almost every other state is way better than Florida on this, actually. Florida was uniquely sort of draconian in some of this land use stuff. But that was a huge first step for us. Was a lot of people just didn't even realize this was a problem, and they understood it. They understood it at the sort of conceptual level that it was a problem. Like, hey, we should make it easier for people to launch schools. But they thought that they'd already sort of solved the fundamental issues, and they hadn't. So that's part 1. Part 2 is there's often a coalition that you can build around things that you want to get changed that's much larger than yourself. And so we were able to build a coalition around a bunch of the innovative education folks, but also nonprofit groups, religious groups that were excited about optionality for how to better use their space. And so once they started getting involved with us, it actually became this pretty broad coalition that was totally bipartisan and wasn't really, hitting any political, lightning rods. And it sort of dulled a lot of the original opposition because it looked more like a pretty common sense thing, which was like, hey, if we want to have, these schools still have to comply with all of the health safety, fire safety laws. We're not going to have them in unsafe conditions. This is really saying if you have a great educator that wants to launch a school for their community in a space that's already used for this, if you're a community center that has classes for kids every weekend from 8 to 5, that use is literally identical to, having a micro school in it from 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. this seems like common sense that we can let this happen. And so once that coalition came together, it was much harder to push back on it. And so those two things ended up allowing us to get the right sponsors on board from a legislative perspective. A sponsor is the legislator that's willing to say, hey, I'm gonna run with this and I'm gonna champion getting this done, and then find the right piece of legislation to either amend or run it as a solo piece of legislation, and then get the right votes in place. And so that's a little bit of the inside baseball.
Does this feel like a replicable process for some of the other big regulatory issues that people run into when starting a microschool? I know the zoning regulations and the land use stuff is one of the big ones that tends to shut people down, but there's all sorts of ins and outs of what that entails, and it can sometimes vary depending on where you're trying to launch a school. Some places are much more laissez-faire than others. Does this feel like a thing that was very custom to the specific problem that you were addressing, or does it feel like something that could apply across the board to other things that are also choking up some of the ability to innovate in and launch new schools?
I'll take that from a couple different angles. So I think that on the land use specifically, Florida is uniquely bad, sort of tough from that perspective. And so most other states don't actually require. There's only 4 or 5 states that I think really need to pass something similar. I think on the broader point, what I would say is that there's been a lot of discussion and policy work and investment from a lot of groups on the demand side of education reform. So how do we find new ways for parents to afford great education options? How do we help people get their tax dollars back if they're not attending a public school? That has received, a ton of focus, and that's where 99% of the energy has gone. And it's probably less than 1% of the energy has gone to the other side of it, which is the supply side. And so you have now families that are seeking other options. But in Florida, for example, the last 4 years, on average, only 38 new non-public schools have launched per year. And that's a state with 3 million K through 2 students. It's like 85,000 students for every one new non-public school that's launched per year. And so I actually shared that stat with someone in the Florida legislature, and they literally didn't believe me. They were like, there's no way that stat is correct. And I had to show them, the actual DOE records to prove to them that was correct. And so I think that there needs to be a lot more emphasis on the supply side of this conversation in general, because parents, we know that parents want options. We know that educators want to provide those options, but there's a tremendous amount of friction sitting in the middle. And in many ways, that is what Primer exists to solve, is that friction. But I think that from a policy perspective, from a just like an advocacy perspective, from like the public conversations, we should be spending a lot more time talking about the supply side than the demand side. The demand side is important, but it's out of whack right now, the proportion of energy going to the demand side versus the supply side. And I think the supply side problems are actually in some ways easier to fix, but they just don't get enough attention. And so a lot of people aren't focused on it.
Why do you think the supply side problems are more important to solve? Because won't having an increase in demand to some extent incentivize the change in supply to also follow? Like, why do you think it's problematic, or what are the biggest problems that you're seeing?
So that only works if it's a market. But if there's arbitrary friction to new supply coming on board, increased demand will increase supply, but it'll be very muted because the friction is going to mute the effect that increased demand should have. I think that I don't think that we should necessarily have more emphasis on supply than demand. I just think that we should have more emphasis than we do now, because that ratio feels out of whack to me. And the reason why is I think that we have an obligation as people who are working in education to deliver a, diligenceable, you can analyze it, you can slice it however you want, set of outcomes for these new education options that prove that these are actually serving families and students really well. And we need a lot of them. We need like hundreds or thousands of these examples. And if we want that to happen, to serve these families that are being failed by the traditional system, we need to make it easier for these new types of programs to come online. We should have very high standards for what we expect of them, but we should make it easier for them to get started. And then those standards, those new programs will become the inspiration and the proof points for families. And then obviously the families directly that attend those will benefit, but then also all the other people that are inspired to start these will start to benefit as well as they start to see the blueprint for it. And so, when you think about a state like Florida only having 38 new, non-public schools in a year, that's indicative of a really big problem for a state that is everyone thinks of as being on the forefront of education innovation. But when you pull back the curtain, it's actually still really, really hard.
That 38 school stat is wild, especially when you consider how fast Florida is growing, how many students there are in the state, how much entrepreneurial spirit exists there. That's wild. What are the other, besides the land use complications and zoning difficulties that schools sometimes run into, what are some of the other big regulatory challenges that tend to come up that cause the most friction in the process of launching a school?
Local land use is far and away the largest one. In some states, there are some DOE requirements that are very difficult that are not as big of a deal for organizations like Primer, but if you're an individual educator that wants to go start a school, they make it almost impossible. So as an example is there's certain states that require very large bonds to be put up if you want to start a school and be approved. And that is often not the educator is not in a position to be able to put up or have the financial, they don't have the financial backing to be able to get approved for the type of things that they require to start a school. There's also some states that have pretty aggressive laws around accreditation. And so if you are if you want to become a new private school provider, it could often take in a given state between 1 and 2 years to get accredited in that state. And some states have some common sense ability or common sense carve outs such that if you are a new provider, you can be in the process of getting accreditation. And as long as you meet the state standards for curriculum and a bunch of other things, you end up in a situation where you're able to still operate while you're in the process of getting accredited. But if you don't have that, you're basically forcing a new educator to be working on this school full time for 1 to 2 years before they can actually have students and actually charge any tuition. And I think that's a very tough spot for a lot of educators that want to start schools. And so I think most of the other things are on the DOE side, and for the most part, states are fixing them. But a lot of it comes down to, the accreditation one is a perfect example where in a vacuum, that sounds like a really great policy. It's like, hey, we should make sure that every school is accredited. That sounds very important. But when you actually talk to an educator who's tried to launch a school and they say, actually, it takes 28 months to get accredited, with the accrediting body that you require in your state. And they want to see, my classrooms and my curriculum and all these things that I need to have in place that cost me money to be able to produce for the accreditation process. This makes it impossible for me to start this without having hundreds of thousands of dollars of savings. And so I think this comes back to the education piece of if you can actually demonstrate what the process looks like, that's the path to getting some of these common sense things passed.
I have to ask, if Florida is one of the most heavily regulated states in terms of land use, and there's such a small number of schools being launched in, you would think it's because it's so difficult to launch schools there. Why did you choose Florida?
There's a great sign that I forget who, I think Patrick Collison maybe tweeted it that said, we did this not because it would be easy, but because we thought it would be easy. And I think that's we did a lot of research before we launched in Florida, but there just wasn't a lot of data points there's only 38 of these a year. So there wasn't a lot of data points on how hard it would be.
Underserved market. Seems easy.
And we thought, and Florida has a reputation of being great from an education innovation perspective. And we talked to a lot of policymakers in the governor's office and a lot of people before we launched in Florida. And it was very much like, hey, we're, everything's easy here. We're the state of educational opportunity. But I think they actually, in many cases, A, that's true. And then B, they believe that. But there's some of these more nuanced regulations that just make it very tough. And so, yes, we learned very quickly that we were actually playing on hard mode. And as we've expanded to other states, I've had multiple conversations with lawyers in other states where I have said some version of, I hear what you're saying, but I want you to know that I don't believe you, because our experience has been so different than this. And they've had to, I had to hire multiple lawyers to get second and third opinions on specific things they're telling me, because it seems so unbelievable relative to Florida. But it really is just much easier in a lot of other states.
I've heard people describe Florida as being like a little bit of a Wild West in education, that it in some ways is less regulated, and it's kind of can be a free for all in terms of what types of schools you're allowed to run and the quality bar for those schools. Am I just wrong? Am I hearing rumors that are totally untrue, or is there also an element of this going on?
I'm sure that on the margins there are, there's schools that are not delivering academically for students. I think that happens obviously everywhere. But the bar is I should say this: the bar to get approved and operate legitimately is extremely high. So there might be people figuring out how to circumvent it and illegitimately operating, and that might be what these people are referring to. But certainly the bar to operating legitimately is very high, and would require someone with good intentions to. I can't imagine taking on all this, without having the intentions of actually launching a high quality school. So perhaps on the illegitimate side, there's some things happening, and I'm sure there is. But I think on the legitimate side, it's mostly good people with good intentions that are just dealing with a very opaque process.
So then Arizona was the second state in which you launched schools. Yep. Was that also because you thought it would be easy? Was it because of all the school choice money that makes it more accessible for people to attend something like Primer, so you have a bigger market? Why was Arizona your second choice?
Most of our expansion has been great educators reaching out to us saying, hey, we want to launch a primer in this area. And so in many ways, the cohort that we're doing in this, as we're opening up this platform, is actually just taking that even further. But we've had that's been our expansion motion almost for every new micro school that we've launched. Has been a great educator reaches out and says, hey, I want to launch this in Scottsdale or Tempe or, wherever outside Phoenix. And they're an exceptional educator that we think would be a great fit. And so we partner with them and launch a school. And so that's been the motion historically. And Arizona has been great and is actually very friendly to new education options, and they make it quite easy to get stood up.
And then you mentioned Texas and Alabama as being other states where you're particularly excited to see applications for your leader cohort from. Are those the states that you have your eye on to expand into next? Are there things that make them particularly desirable states to be building in? What's the thought process there?
Yeah, we'll share more on this in the coming weeks. But in Alabama, we've partnered. I'll just say we have a partnership with some folks in the state government that's going to open up a lot of opportunities for students in Alabama to bring Primer to Alabama. So that was something that they initiated, and we're very excited about. So we'll share more about that in a few weeks. And then Texas has always been a market we've been really excited about. We've had a bunch of Primer leaders that have reached out wanting to launch primers in Texas, and so we're definitely committed to making that happen.
I hope you have a Primer location open in Austin sooner than later, because I have people ask me all the time in Austin. I'll show up at a party and people be like, "Oh, you work in education. I have kids. What do you recommend?" And I would love for Primer to be on the list of things that I'm sharing. I'm like, well, if you want to go to Miami, but if you're looking for Austin,
let's do it.
And there's a ton of stuff happening here, but the more options, the better on the list. I would love to see a Primer here. Also, I have people who keep asking me when I'm going to start a school, and the more places I can recommend them, the longer I can procrastinate.
You can delay starting a school.
Starting one of my own. Someday, I keep telling people, it's like maybe when I have kids of my own and I just can't help myself, like there's a very strong probability that when I have children, I won't be able to resist. But until then,
just be careful. You might blink and be running a micro school network across the country. So just be careful.
Is that what happened to you?
Sort of.
I don't think I asked you this in our last interview. Did launching Primer have anything to do with being a parent? Are you building something in part because you want your kids to have access to it, or are these two complementary but unrelated in terms of causation things?
No, that was the original inspiration. My wife and I started having kids, and we started doing the normal parent thing of looking at schools. And
You're
my
like,
mom, we grew up in Florida. We were zoned for a bad public school, and so my mom started what was like this sort of like hybrid co-op micro school thing in the early
with your
90s.
neighbors, right?
Yeah, and it was amazing. But what was unique about it was that it was both from a pedagogy perspective, it was both pretty intense academics. Like she didn't shy away at all. She was a former teacher. So I remember like at the beginning of the year, she would write down everything we needed to learn in math or whatever subject. And she would just say, you got to do all this year. I don't care if you do it in 3 months or 6 months or 9 months, but this is what you got to get done. So it's pretty rigorous from an academic perspective. But then also in the afternoons, we would have this time to be able to like explore things that we were excited about. So my siblings and I were always like starting business ideas and working on projects and working on creative things. And that was really interesting. It was amazing to me. And then as an adult, it was interesting to me. It was amazing to me as a kid. And then it was interesting to me as an adult because it's very difficult to find a school that has that similar barbell approach. You can find the elite charter or private world that will give you very rigorous academics, but very low agency. And then you can find the Montessori world that'll give you very high agency, but as kids get older, I think is lacking in a lot of the core academics. And Primer was sort of like the brainchild of trying to figure out how to deliver that sort of barbell approach, both because it's what I wanted for my kids, and also, what I thought, hundreds of thousands, millions of families would also want.
We've talked a lot about the software part of what you guys do. We've talked a lot about the regulatory side. Can we talk about the operations side a little bit too? Because that's another place that you're really streamlining the process for your school leaders. What are the infrastructure pieces that you have in place to make that easy for people versus what are the things that a school leader coming in and starting a micro school should expect to have to do?
Yeah. We try to, the way we think about operations is there's a lot of things that that primer leaders do not want to spend any time thinking about. And for those things, we want to, as much as possible, make them not have to think about that at all. And so they just want, the supplies to show up, and they want to have an easy way to ensure that their day-to-day operation is going to be smooth. And so we try to handle those things that they don't want to think about. And then there's also things that they do want to think about, and educators are really excited about thinking about. And so we try to give them a lot of control and the ability to invest in those things. And so we've had, leaders that have like painted beautiful murals like across their micro schools and done like amazing projects with kids to, renovate or decorate a space. And so we like totally encourage all of that. But then our goal is that the initial setup and the day-to-day operation is extremely smooth. And so we want to make sure that from an initial setup perspective, they don't need to think about any of that, and they can basically just know that they're going to be off to the races a couple weeks before school starts. And then from a day-to-day operations, they're going to have a centralized ops team that can help them as if things go wrong or something pops up. And then we also use that to ensure that we're hitting the quality bar that we have across the network. And so making sure that the space is hitting our bar, making sure that the parent, pick up and drop off experience is hitting our bar, all those things. And then we're able to sort of parachute in and get those things tweaked and fixed as needed. But for the most part, it really like the primary leaders are amazing. And they really are like entrepreneurs that are choosing to launch these schools in their communities. And they take a ton of pride in them. And they deliver really great experiences operationally, and they're very good at troubleshooting and jumping in when things get off track. So we're mostly there to create the right buffers and make sure when something happens, they have the resources they need. But for the most part, they're totally autonomous and able to go do the thing.
Are they primarily former public school teachers, or are some of them coming from other backgrounds?
It's all over: public, private, charter. A lot of people we actually have a lot of teachers that retired from teaching and then went and did something else, and they were sick of teaching. And then they decided that they heard about Primer, and they actually still love teaching, but they hated. One of them said something to me. She said last week. She said, I realized that I love teaching, but I hate being a teacher. And I thought it was such a I haven't been able to stop thinking about that quote since she said it, because it's such a great distillation about how, and she went on to talk about this, like she would spend hours every weekend doing paperwork. It was this constant like test prep, like hamster wheel where she was just constantly being evaluated by the latest test scores, and she had no time to actually engage with kids or give them, what they needed to meet them where they were at. And it's such an interesting distillation about how this sort of the bureaucratic Leviathan will eventually go after, even the most honorable, historically joyful professions. Eventually it will suck all the joy out of them. And she was just done. She's like, I'm just sick of it. I came here to invest in kids and build relationships with kids and help them progress academically, not to spend 12 hours every week, filling out paperwork. And so we have a lot of people that hear about Primer and realize that Primer is a place they can come and do what they love, which is invest in students' lives and not spend any time on things they don't love, which is endless paperwork and mountains of bureaucracy. And so there's a lot of these kind of boomerang things where people leave the system and then go do something else, then hear about Primer and actually come back into teaching, which is cool.
Do you have requirements around people who become Primer teachers having degrees in teaching, or do you ever have people come in who are coming from other backgrounds and want to get into education but haven't gone through the traditional system? Is there a place for people like that to also get involved, or is it primarily people who have gone through the normal path of becoming a teacher but then want to step outside of the institutional system?
We adhere to whatever the state requirements are for teachers operating schools. So in some states that's a teaching certificate, in some states that's a bachelor's degree. So we adhere to whatever those are. We have our own separate background check, safety side of it that we run that's very rigorous. And then typically they have pretty intense education experience. So sometimes that's in administration, so former principal, assistant principal. Sometimes that's in the more like curriculum side. So they might be a curriculum developer or a teacher, like a trainer for a district. And then sometimes that's direct, they've been a teacher for 15 years or and want to switch over. We're pretty in general, we are sort of fine with any of those backgrounds. We care a lot more about the three things I talked about earlier, and we find that people from any of those backgrounds can have it. And we also really like when people have non-traditional backgrounds. So I spoke to someone yesterday who wants to launch Primer in his community, and he worked in tech for many years and then went back and got a teaching degree and has been a teacher at a charter school for 4 or 5 years and now wants to launch his own school. And that his background is awesome. And he's super inspiring to talk to. I talked to someone the other day who was in the Army for 12 years and then became a school teacher, and she wants to launch her own Primer. And so we love those like non-traditional backgrounds, and it provides a really rich experience for the students that are in those schools. So the more non-traditional, the better, but we do obviously adhere to all the state standards and some education. We look for education experience in some way.
So let's go back to the Primer leader cohort and talk about the specifics of this a little bit more, because you said it's a thing that you can do in the evenings and the weekends. You can do it on top of your current job, but it's spanning the duration of a full school year. If I understand correctly, it starts this fall and runs until the end of next spring.
Yep.
What are people going to be going through over the course of those 9-ish months? Is it primarily trainings? Are they going to be doing hands-on work to actually get a school set up over the course of this time? What is this going to look like?
Yeah. So we'll give, you start by getting access to Primer OS. So you get access to the full tech stack from the student experience, your experience as a microschool leader, plus the parent side. You then also get our team's help in, you'll work to secure a location, which our team will help with. And you get the kind of regulatory engine behind you on that and getting that location approved for a school. And then you'll work on recruiting students. And so our team will sort of, hold your hand and help you with that process, but you'll work on recruiting students. And there's different milestones to hit throughout that process. And so over the course of the fall, be working primarily towards those milestones on student recruiting and securing a location. And then in the spring, transitioning into how do you actually launch and run a Primer and deliver great outcomes for kids. And so that's everything from the academic program to the operations stuff we talked about, understanding how to engage with the community that you're in, understanding the nuances of each individual student academic pathway and how we think about advanced work versus remedial work versus on grade level work. And so it's really like you can think of it almost like an executive MBA for launching a school. So over the course of those 9 months, you will learn everything you need to know about how to successfully launch a primer. And our team will walk you through the process, and there's no financial risk to you. So we're taking on the financial risk, and we're helping you hit these milestones. And then in August, you'll be able to launch your own primer in your community.
If people want to know more about this or more about Primer in general or the work that you're doing, where would you send them next?
So primer.com/launch is where you can apply. You can learn about the cohort and you can apply to the cohort. We will have applications open throughout August and September at a minimum. The first cohort will kick off September 9th, and then we'll do another cohort after that. And then if you have friends that you'd be interested in starting a primer with, would encourage you to apply with them so they can each apply. And we've had several cases where groups of teachers who've known each other decided to launch a primer together, and that's been extremely successful. So we would definitely encourage that. And then if you want to just learn more about primer and the academic model and the current Microschools, primer.com is where you can go. And then I'm at Delk on Twitter. Feel free to DM me or just r@primer.com. So if you're interested in the cohort, I would love to meet you and talk to you. And if you just have questions on primer in general, feel free to reach out as well.
This has been amazing. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy week prior to schools kicking off for the year to have this conversation. This has been super fun.
Yes, thanks, Hannah.
All right, my friends, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this valuable. Please leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Please like the video on YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you so much, friends. I will see you next week.